The next session is, does the USG's perception of international cyber issues match with reality? So we've got some great speakers here today. We've got Jeanette, Manfra, Steve Hill, and then we're going to bring in Glenn Gerstell, who's going to be our moderator for this. So Glenn, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Matt, and Suzanne, thank you. This has been a terrific event so far with a lot of terrific experts, and we're going to try to continue that pattern with two other superb experts, Jeanette and Steve here. So let's get right to it. So this session is intended to address whether the US government's perception of cyber issues matches with the international reality. Of course, just by virtue of its size, of its economy, and the role American information and communications technology plays in the world, what the US says and does will have profound ramifications for the rest of the world. So Jeanette, let's start with you. You've got the benefit of having served on the National Security Council staff and as an assistant secretary at DHS for cyber policy. So you're very familiar with the official government view and policy in this area. So let's start by asking you just really simply, what's your perception, your understanding based on your years in government office and of course now outside at Google, of just what that perception is? How does the US view this cyber arena?
Yeah, thanks so much, and happy to be here again. Such a great event. I think where I'll start with where I think that they're doing things right, and sort of hearkening back a little bit to the cyber strategy, and as sort of the cyber policy and all the operations and apparatus has evolved over time. I think there are some of the things that they continue to get right, particularly when it comes to international. In other areas where they sort of continue to perhaps miss some really large shifts that are happening globally, and so on the areas where I really like they're focusing on, in particular what they call sort of the two strategic shifts in the strategy, and really rebalancing the responsibilities for protecting our sort of digital ecosystem to those that are most capable of doing that. Now, we could talk for hours about who those are, but in general, that is something that I worked really hard on when I was in the government. One of the reasons I came to Google is because I felt that we had the capability and the capacity to really sort of achieve change at a scale that you can't sort of get when you focus kind of on an individual or an owner and operator. So I love that framing. Now, what does that actually mean in practice? Is a really important thing to think about. Also love the concept of, how do we think about more long-term investments? Where I think sort of some of the challenges come into play, and it goes back to a long history, and it's not just in cybersecurity, it's actually sort of thinking about security in general is a heavy sort of reliance on government access to information in order to be able to better protect, defend, make decisions. And that's sort of, I guess, kind of one sort of underlying premise. Now, where I like to see where the US government is going is it's not just about the information and the sharing of that information and the access to the information. We're also starting to have a bias towards action and all of that, and I like that. But the reality is that when you are dependent, and a large part of your strategy is dependent on access to information, you do set up a conflict globally, and that starts to bring into privacy concerns and other countries' sovereignty when you're talking about largely US companies that are global providers of services. So I think that is something that is not often and frequently enough talked about in US sort of security intelligence circles, is the reality that I'm the global risk and compliance director, so I have to ensure that Google can manage and meet our global obligations, and that we are successfully globally in doing that. And we'll talk more about kind of that regulatory framework. So I think that's sort of that really key piece. And I think the other piece is that the market of kind of internet digital ecosystem more broadly has evolved significantly. And it kind of goes back to which of those players are the right ones. And it goes back to the leverage that the US government actually has, which I think that there is potentially misalignment with how much leverage the government does believe that they might have versus other countries who have moved out much more significantly on regulations, on laws that are driving, whether it's a critical infrastructure entity or a technology provider, to take action. So they are really shaping a lot of those sort of cybersecurity practices more than the United States is.
Good, thanks. That very helpful. I want to get to Steve in a minute, but let me, Jeanette, just mention two quick points. One is, I do want to underscore what you said about the new national cyber strategy being so significant, in particular in the areas of shifting, proposing to shift the liability from the end user back onto hardware manufacturers and software manufacturers and perhaps platform operators, et cetera. So wherever that liability shift is going, it's moving away from the user, and that's really quite profound and mimics what we've done in other areas of technology, of course. And then secondly, the focus for the government, to the Biden administration, to officially come out and say regulation is going to be a very significant part of this policy. Again, something that prior administrations have been hesitant to say. Let me just follow up on that one thing, and we'll go to Steve. But Jeanette, on the regulation, how do you see the U.S. regulatory approach to privacy and cyber regulation, which is to say, I think, fairly thin, compare to that elsewhere?
Well, I think you summarized it perfectly.
Big question, but maybe you could just give it.
It's very thin, and so what ends up happening is that de facto, principally Europe is setting the direction for how privacy and cybersecurity is being managed. And I know there's a lot of discussion about how the U.S. is aligning to some of that, but it really is set the standard. And you have now many countries in emerging markets, in APAC, in Latin America, that are really just taking what Europe has done and applying it into their own regimes. And so I think de facto that is what is happening. And the U.S., and again, it kind of goes to this access of information sort of thing. We're sort of focused on incident reporting in it, and we can talk about that a little bit more of, is that the most important sort of regulatory initiative that should be focusing on? I think that's a worthwhile debate, and fundamentally we really just now start to see these conflicts between what the U.S. government is looking for strategically versus what other countries are actually legislating. Absolutely,
and that's a good segue to get us over to Steve, sitting across the Atlantic here in London, as I understand, of course, you're a lot closer to the EU form of regulation in this area, which is quite significant, as well as the UK regulation. So, Steve, as a British citizen, longtime senior official in the Foreign Office and Commonwealth Office, what's your sense of how the US government perceptions match the wider reality, particularly from the UK and European perspective?
Thanks, Glenn. I mean, what's striking over the last 2 hours is the degree of consensus there is on this call. Pretty much everybody agreeing with everybody else. I think about, the wish for a free, open, secure internet, the threat stack of actors, what we should be doing in response across people, processes, and technology. I don't think anybody here will disagree with anything at the top level of the US cyber strategy. But I think there are two areas which it's worth highlighting, which perhaps sort of throw a little bit of sort of sand into that. The first is there's a real danger of solipsism here. Everybody agrees with everybody else, but it's not the global view. Even in Europe, very close to the US, there is an innate suspicion, both of US tech companies, the big tech companies, and that marries into a suspicion of the US government agenda, post-Snowden. And that, I think, has driven a lot of the regulation, GDPR, the UK Online Safety Bill that's currently going through, and the sense that I think Janet highlighted really well, that it's actually Europe driving the regulatory global agenda.
Can I interrupt you there for a second?
No, of course.
I think you're making a really critical point, which is that my perception, and you're a lot closer to it, is that the European concern over some of the U.S. technology is not only surveillance driven, which is the fallout of Snowden, so to speak, but very significantly about the fear that U.S. technology will envelop and overwhelm European technology, and we've certainly seen that in some of the proposed European regulations and their pushback on big tech platforms. But I just thought you made that a really great point. I wanted to underscore that.
Yeah, and I think the slow exit of Europe from Chinese infrastructure technology reflects the same thing. The US kind of narrative about the fear of the Chinese surveillance rings hollow. And then if you switch to the wider world, the global south and non-aligned, I think that the views that we now see on Ukraine are symptomatic of, a wider battle for hearts and minds, which the US is not necessarily any longer winning quite as much. I think that increasingly the rest of the world is looking to China as a realistic alternative to the US. The Chinese are getting their act together in terms of the quality of their products as an alternative. And I think that they have a potential now globally for sort of cyber interventions, what the UK calls active cyber defense, which is not to be underestimated given their reach. Look at India, for example, now is essentially a sort of back office for the whole of the Western kind of private sector world in terms of data, in terms of software, our IT reliance upon them. Can you have Western cyber security without having Indian cyber security? I'm not really sure. So I think the first point, if you like, I'll only make two, but the first point is about that sort of dangerous solipsism. The second is that even if we accept that USG perception of cybersecurity, kind of so what? Because for me, the real challenge, if you're in the private sector, if you're working in a bank or in a commercial, is in the execution. I thought the last panel was really good. When I go into boards, they basically want to know, or senior executives, they want to know, but what do you actually want us to do? I think that few people can kind of argue with the US cybersecurity strategy, the new one. But it kind of avoided, in my view, quite a lot of the tricky judgment calls when going down to the next level of detail. And you look now at the debate that you're having where you are about TikTok. I think the really interesting question there is, why did it take so long to address this risk? And why did we basically, the US government, wait until TikTok was so embedded, frankly, in US society that it's really now difficult? And are we sort of in the same position when we're talking about, language, large language model AI, quantum decryption, and so on? So I think there is a little bit of a misalignment where it's really easy at one level to talk in generalizations, but then when really the rubber hits the tire and you have to make proper practical decisions. And for boards, let's be very, very clear, the economic situation is what is top of their risk register. It's survival in really challenging economic situations. And I'm not sure that we're always doing the right thing to kind of pursue that detailed, what actually do you want people to do in regulatory terms, or, in terms of, competing for finite budgets.
Yep. Do you have any particular examples that you want to point to of this misalignment as a result of these two points that you just made?
Yeah, I mean, Jeanette and I were talking previously about cyber incident reporting, because at a high level, this is clearly a common good that enhances systemic resilience. Right. Very few people, I think, would now argue that you can leave it to the market, that that from goodness of our hearts, private companies will do this, and all of the reporting on ransomware and so on suggests that quite a lot of the information doesn't make it out more widely. So therefore, the response has been a regulatory one. I think the challenges are that, first of all, some of that regulation can be frankly unrealistic. The best example I've read in recent weeks has been, so in India last year, 2022, they had 1.4 million attacks by their own accounts. They introduced kind of regulation that said any unauthorized access of IT systems and data needs to be reported within 6 hours. quite a challenge. They have received, I think, last year or since they've gone, 15 reports. Now, either there's been a massive drop-off or they're just asking for something that people cannot deliver.
Right.
Secondly, there's inconsistency. I mean, 72 hours seem to be becoming a global norm for the kind of period before you had to report something, because it takes quite a while in practice to be able to know if you've actually had an incident or not, or whether it's just some kind of some mishandled change. But just recently, you know, a banker was fined by the European Bank 3.1 million euros because they reported within 48 hours, and the rules they subsequently discovered was actually they should have reported within 2 hours. And then even worse than this is the bifurcated world that I think we're hearing about in the last panel, where it's not just about complexity, it's about contradiction. How do you comply with the US Cloud Act and with the Chinese security law if you are basically operating in those two places? How do you comply with the push for ubiquitous encryption and at the same time comply with all the monitoring kind of obligations that you have? And even something like Ukraine, I mean, wonderful, as always, a really interesting and wonderful intervention by the Ukrainian representative earlier. But you know, their hacktivist IT army, you know, which has been disrupting Russia, you know, during the State of the Nation, Putin's State of the Nation, disrupting, you know, it's kind of a romantic ideal that they're doing some great work. But at the same time, that's exactly what we've been calling the Russians out for doing with their criminal gangs and not seeing that. So I think it's, when you get down to the details, it's much trickier than simply saying it would be really good if everybody reported their cyber incidents. I mean, Jeanette, is that your view as well?
Yeah, I think you've stated it all really beautifully. I think, and you know, so pick on the Cloud Act is a great example here. One of the #1 things that people want to know is how can you confirm and prove that the US government will not have access to my data? And it really starts to get into this, you know, the sovereignty related conversations, which absolutely, Glenn, to your point earlier, there's absolutely an economic dimension to this. In terms of, you know, many of these countries recognize that they have to rely on you know, I don't know, providers that are, I guess, subject to their local regulations, although once you're doing business in there, of course, you're subject to it. So there's absolutely that dimension there. But what has really been set up is this fundamental tension about every time, you know, sort of the US puts forward a requirement for access to information or reporting of information, there is going to be an equal and potentially greater sort of reaction in multiple countries that have a strong voice in the marketplace. And so then you start to get into these really difficult scenarios that most companies are starting to trying to sort out. How do we navigate conflicting, you know, requirements? And none of this gets to a better security outcome in the end. And so I think that's really where it would just sort of, I guess, emphasize everything that Steve said. And it really kind of goes back to, I think, a bit of a disconnect from the US in how the market and the legal environment has evolved well beyond what it was, you know, 10 years when they were sort of first 10 years ago when they were first sort of setting some of these policies. And I'm not suggesting they have to roll out a bunch of regulations. If they do it, it'd be nice if it was harmonized. But that it, you know, and that does help with the execution. But to me, it's a bit more of a philosophical shift that the US government and the folks who support them and think about this stuff that we need to sort of really understand and talk about much more deeply than I think people are, at least in the US.
Absolutely. You know, you talked about harmonizing regulations, and certainly with the new cyber strategy, and just for the past couple of years, we've heard a lot about the need to harmonize reporting regulations across industries, sectors, et cetera, so that we don't have a one standard for public companies under SEC proposed rules and another standard under CISA's own critical infrastructure rules and maybe sector-specific reporting, et cetera. So there's been a lot of focus on the need to harmonize domestically, not so much internationally. I want to pick up on that in a minute, but we certainly saw that even in such different approaches as I think Steve mentioned TikTok. So, we waited until there were 150 million American users of it, and then we started going around saying it's a national security risk and should be banned. Not an idea I'm in favor of, but we're on the American side, we're sort of puzzled why our allies aren't taking the same view. I know in the UK there's a much more, I'll say, somewhat more relaxed attitude toward TikTok. Doesn't have quite the same emotional fervor that it does here. And the same is true in Europe. We saw that a couple of years ago with the US efforts to ban Huawei equipment. And on the US side, we were surprised that everyone in Europe didn't immediately understand it from our point of view. So I think on the US side, we sometimes take the significance of US communications infrastructure so much for granted that we don't realize that others perceive it differently overseas. Let's move on, and maybe I'll just ask Steve first and then Jeanette, but maybe throw the final question out to both of you. We've spoken about the areas, mostly regulatory, where the US arguably isn't getting it right. But what about the area of international law and diplomacy? What can the United States government do to add more value and contribute in the most positive way? For all of its importance, all cyber's importance, cyber's governed internationally by really just one treaty, the 2001 Budapest Convention on Cybercrime. And the US has been working, the UN has been working for years on a proposed comprehensive international convention on countering the use of information and communications technology for criminal purposes. Quite a catchy title that only the UN could come up with, but they're still working on that. But even without treaties, we've seen more international cooperation in the law enforcement area with taking down the Hive network, et cetera. Of course, no one's saying we've won the war, but what's your sense in terms of what the U.S. government should do in this area? And Steve, I'll just turn to you very quickly. In particular, do you have any thoughts on whether the upcoming second summit for democracy that the Biden administration is pushing could be a venue for some of these cyber discussions in the international law area?
So I spent quite a few years at the UN in New York when I was in the government, and I sat in on some of those UN cyber meetings, and I really don't have much confidence that that's the way that we should go forward. And even if you look at the kind of, the Obama-Xi cyber bilateral agreement, didn't kind of last very long. I don't think that that's the way forward. Coming forward at kind of a high level, in the summits that you're talking about, it cannot do any harm. It can, but at the same time, it's the same issue, is that at a high level, we're all going to agree broadly. The fact that actually it's the Russians and the Chinese who are most pushing those UN kind of conventions at the moment, I think does tell us something. So what can the US do? It still does have massive convening power, and it still has massive influence. For me, the more that the US can lead by example, the rest of the world will follow. So I think there is an example. There's something around, prioritizing maybe cyber defense over cyber offense, which doesn't always happen. Secondly, I think that the sort of cyber escalation dominance that was demonstrated in the context of Ukraine, I think that, and the willingness to signal to the Russians what the consequences might be if they escalated, I think that was actually pretty, both in terms of capability but also in willingness. I think that was effective. I think that was good. I think that I love the FBI and what their work is. The Hive stuff that Cynthia Kaiser spoke about before, it's really practical. It takes down some of those key hubs. It does the things which any individual company in the private sector cannot and should not be doing. That's where I think maximum value can be added. And then lastly, I'd like to see the US leading by example on the bit we haven't really talked about much in this session. It came up in previous ones, which is all around disinformation, fake news. That the bit that the Russians think about as being and have been quite successful at as their sort of cyber effort. Right. That's the paradigm through which they see it. The US has maybe got a little bit more to do to be the kind of role model for that, but that is what I certainly would like to see.
All good points. I think you've pretty much covered it, but Jeanette will give you the privilege of the last word for the last minute or two here.
No, I don't think I could say it better. I guess I would say I would emphasize the law enforcement cooperation. For years, that process has been cumbersome, and so sort of the work to continue to improve that, sort of keep focusing on this like practical aspect of, yes, we can all agree on norms and we can agree on sort of behavior, not all, but generally, and so really like what are those practical avenues? We have a global problem, so what are the different global mechanisms we have, and mutual law enforcement assistance, and strengthening that cooperation and making it easier and sort of more streamlined, I think is super important, and love to see the work there. The convening power is still a really, really important lever that the United States has, and sort of leveraging that though for more kind of practical, what are we doing to, when you talk about sort of shifting responsibility to those who can do something about it, okay, well, we have states, global companies, other things that can do something about a global issue. So let's sort of not sort of just focus on kind of the US aspect, but where are those kind of global points that we can all kind of come together and have a more sort of targeted influence. I guess I'm talking more of like an operational, on the defense, not on the offense side, to be totally clear. But I think those are the two things that I guess I would really leave with, where I would like to see more practical, and we are seeing practical work, but I'd like to see that emphasized.
Great. Well, as I'm sure, I think the audience would agree with me that having heard from Jeanette and Steve, we probably could spend another 2 hours at least on this topic of international perceptions and the need for the U.S. to engage that way in a more harmonized and effective way. But I think Suzanne's not going to let us do that, because I know you want to talk about the national cyber strategy, which we teed up for you very, very expertly. So let me turn that back, and with thanks to Jeanette and Steve, and turn it back to Matt and Suzanne, and thank you all.
Thank you so
Very
much.
Appreciate that conversation. It's fantastic. I loved also Matt kind of going global, understanding what the realities are, and if the perception really matches up to those realities. Glenn, just masterful job as always. Thank you so much.
Great,
The Cypher Brief, because national security is everyone's business.